So today we're going to be jumping from the more traditional weird to 1960s re-envisionings of certain weird tropes and concepts. We're going to be looking particularly at the British science fiction writer Michael Moorcock and his most famous creation, the albino sorcerer anti-hero Elric of Melniboné. Now, we can see a clear line from the work of Clark Ashton Smith and the work of Robert E. Howard to Moorcock, as well as a strong reaction against several of the tropes of high fantasy that were common in the mid-20th century in the works of writers like J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Charles Williams. So what Moorcock is trying to do is sort of use an infusion of American science fiction, American dark fantasy, to move British fantasy in a different direction. One that he felt was sort of more suited to the postmodern world. So let's talk a little bit about where Elric comes from exactly, where he first appears and how he starts to develop. So Moorcock was writing as a young man in the 1950s for a magazine called Tarzan Adventures that was aimed primarily at young boys. And he wrote a series of Conan pastiches about a character called Sojan the Swordsman for Tarzan Adventures. And it's sort of in this character that we see the roots of what would become Elric, like sort of the sorts of qualities in Conan that Moorcock is going to start moving away from. The first Elric story, The Dreaming City, appears in a magazine called Science Fantasy in June 1961. This is the cover of that issue of Science Fantasy. And one thing to note about the Elric stories as they were originally published, much like the Conan stories, they are not published as a kind of chronological record of Elric's career. They cover a variety of different points in his life and career, and often sort of like, they're not written in chronological order. They go back and forth in time quite a bit. So the story of Elrics Origins, which is simply called Elric of Melniboné, I believe, is not published until 1972. The Dreaming City, though, does recount probably what Moorcock would consider to be the most important event in Elric's life, which would be the destruction of his home city of Imrir, and the death by his hand of his lover Cimmeril. So Elric tales appear pretty regularly in science fantasy until October 1964. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they're collected into novels. I put novels in quotes here because they were not originally intended to tell a continuous chronological story. They're put in order rather the way Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp, when they were publishing Conan anthologies in the 60s and 70s, artificially constructed them into chronological narratives and wrote their own stories to fill in the gaps. Now the difference here is that Moorcock does this himself. So there's nobody filling in new Elric material to make the novel more consistent and coherent. Right? This is all Moorcock's own published material. The first original Elric novel is 1972's Elric of Melniboné, which, as I said, sort of describes his origins and his brief reign as emperor of the Melnibonians, seated on the ruby throne of Imrir. So Moorcock is part of a movement that's often called the new wave of British science fiction. And in addition to Moorcock, it includes writers like J.G. Ballard and Brian Aldiss. Their primary vehicle for publication was a magazine called New Worlds, which Moorcock edited from 1964 to 1970, and then became a sort of series of paperback anthologies that Moorcock continued to edit. This is an example of a cover of an issue of New Worlds, featuring a story about another Moorcock hero, Elric's sort of contemporary world counterpart, Jerry Cornelius. Most of Moorcock's fantasy protagonists are regarded as incarnations of a single individual. More on that in a moment. And the new wave of British science fiction had not just genre popularity ambitions, but literary fiction ambitions as well. Now, genre fiction, by and large, gets a really bad rap, right? Fantasy, science fiction, detective thrillers, horror, right? It's usually not admitted into the mainstream literary canon. It's regarded as, formulaic, right? That's why we call it genre fiction. It's easy to categorize. It's easy to recognize recurrent features across works. So what Moorcock and his cohorts were trying to do was use modernist and postmodernist literary techniques like flashback, stories told out of order, stream of consciousness, to make science fiction and fantasy more literary. They also tended, as a result, to kind of blur distinctions between good and evil that had animated fantasy fiction in particular for a long time. So we see that sort of in Elric in particular. Is Elric good? Is Elric evil? Well, yes and no. Now, one thing that makes these guys different from traditional science fiction writers, particularly those of the early and mid-20th centuries, is that they're less interested in engineering and in clever contraptions and in space exploration than they are in the social sciences. So you will find a lot more concepts from psychology and sociology creeping into new wave of British science fiction writers. And I think I already mentioned their oppositional attitude towards that earlier generation of fantasists, right? They don't want the sort of Tolkien-esque or C.S. Lewis-esque hierarchical pastoral world. They're aiming at something different, something they see as more contemporary. So Moorcock, for example, wrote an essay called Epic Pooh that compares The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia to the children's classic Winnie the Pooh. And here we have an Epic Pooh. I'm glad I specified Winnie the Pooh for this because you can really take that phrase the wrong way. So Moorcock argues in this essay that traditional British fantasy was based on a form of romantic pastoral escapism, right? The creation of secondary worlds in Tolkien and Lewis provides the reader an escape from the problems of the real world, right? You can immerse yourself in the fantastic, unbelievable problems of Middle-earth or of Narnia, and you know that everything's going to come out right in the end. Now, one of the other things that bothers Moorcock about traditional fantasy is the way it reinforces traditional class hierarchies. The Lord of the Rings, for example, is ultimately about the restoration of a king to the throne. And once the king comes back to Minas Tirith, right, the Dark Lord is overthrown, and everything is set to rights. So it's a hierarchical, feudal world. We can say similar things about C.S. Lewis's Narnia, right? It's always clear who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. The good guys are always, at least implicitly, Christian. And one of the interesting things about Lewis's fantasies is that ultimately the heroes in Lewis's fantasies never really manage to do anything on their own. It's always Aslan, the Jesus allegory lion, working through them, or working for them, like doing things for them. So Lewis's fantasies, Moorcock sees as rather passive. So the big problem with both of these classic fantasy texts, according to Moorcock, is essentially that they tend towards restoration of an unsatisfactory, conservative Tory status quo. Isn't it nice that the king has come back and put everything in order? Right? We see the same problem working out through the Lord of the Rings from a relatively secular perspective. Right? Tolkien was a devout Catholic, but there's nothing explicitly Christian about the Lord of the Rings or about Middle-earth. Whereas, in a book like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right, we're explicitly dealing with the world of Christian allegory. And Aslan, the first king of Narnia, has to come back and set everything to rights and put his chosen representatives on the throne. So one of the things that Moorcock is pushing back against is what he sees as the sort of moralistic conservative bent in British fantasy writing. So where does he turn for inspiration instead? Well, we already mentioned Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard. He takes from Smith the exotic, decadent settings and the moral ambiguity. And from Howard, well, it's sort of fairly easy to see Elric as a kind of anti-Conan. Right? Conan is a barbarian from a young land, right, in a young world, operating amongst civilized people, and not always understanding their ways perfectly. He's huge, he's strong, he's courageous, he distrusts magic, and trusts in the strength of his arm and the strength of his sword. Now Elric, like Conan, is a wandering adventurer, but he's almost his polar opposite, right? Where Conan is strong, Elric is physically weak. His power is given to him through dark pacts with chaos gods, through drugs that keep his weak, listless body alive and moving, and through his symbiotic bond with the Black Sword Stormbringer. Elric also has been a king and lost his kingdom. Conan, in the course of his career, gains a kingdom. So Conan starts as a barbarian, becomes a king. Elric starts as a king and becomes a wandering adventurer. Conan's a barbarian. Elric is hyper-civilized. And in fact, any concessions towards barbarism we see in Elric tend to be sort of ironic and cosmetic. For example, if we look on page 14, when Elric first appears before the Sea Lords in the Dreaming City. Elric was tall, broad-shouldered, and slim-hipped. He wore his long hair bunched and pinned at the nape of his neck, and for an obscure reason, affected the dress of a southern barbarian. He had long, knee-length boots of soft doe leather, a breastplate of strangely wrought silver, a jerkin of checkered blue and white linen, breeches of scarlet wool, and a cloak of rustling green velvet. At his hip rested his rune sword of black iron, the feared Stormbringer, forged by ancient and alien sorcery. His bizarre dress was tasteless and gaudy, and did not match his sensitive face and long-fingered, almost delicate hands, yet he flaunted it, since it emphasized the fact that he did not belong in any company, that he was an outlander and an outcast. But, in reality, he had little need to wear such outlandish gear, for his eyes and skin were enough to mark him. So the key word in this passage is affected, right? Elric's people do not dress like southern barbarians. He chooses to do so. He chooses to wear this sort of gaudy, silly costume to emphasize an otherness that is already obvious to everyone around him. French existentialism, particularly the work of Camus and Sartre, is a big influence on Moorcock as well. More on that in a moment. Quantum physics, right? The idea of a multiverse, which again we'll explain a little bit later on, comes directly from certain statements attributed to Erwin Schrödinger. And here we see Pooh, once again, eating recursion, and just sort of going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth at a time. Now, other fantasy writers who influence Moorcock include Paul Anderson, especially a novel called The Broken Sword, in which the hero is given by the god Odin the cursed sword from the old Volsung saga, similar to Wagner's Ring, the source material for Wagner's Ring cycle, and with this curse ends up destroying everything he loves, as well as the contemporary Gothic fantasies of Mervyn Peake, particularly his Gormenghast trilogy. Now, Elric's albinism is taken directly from a villain called Monsieur Zenith, a Romanian aristocrat and jewel thief who appears in a series of detective stories by the British writer Anthony Skene. So he's drawing on detective fiction, he's drawing on sword and sorcery, he's drawing on fantasy fiction, and on science and philosophy to put together this world and this character. Now, some of you may have some passing familiarity with existentialism, but let's just sort of try to give you sort of a brief thumbnail definition in ways that will help us through these particular stories. So existentialism is, sort of loosely speaking, a school of philosophy that emphasizes the importance of freedom and of authenticity. Now, what this means, right? Freedom is not necessarily as inherently positive a concept in existentialism as we might think it is. An existentialist regards the world outside the self as inherently meaningless, or even absurd, right? The only meaning anything outside of you has is the meaning that you assign to it. So you have the freedom to assign meaning to a meaningless universe. Order and duty are illusions that some people cling to in order to convince themselves that there is actually some inherent underlying meaning in the world. There is some external guarantor of meaning, whether it be God or the state, or a philosophy, right? Some force outside the self that provides the rest of the world with meaning. And existentialists would argue that by and large that doesn't exist. And your obedience to these kinds of concepts it indicates that you are not willing to be free or to live authentically. So the individual's task, according to an existentialist, is to figure out how to live authentically, how to live an authentic life, a life that acknowledges that there is no given meaning in the world. And I think, here we see a picture of Elric brooding over a book. I think that this is a lot of what is going on in the Elric stories. It's Elric torn loose from his roots, torn loose from the sort of, frankly wicked and largely despicable culture in which he has grown up. Right, this decadent society that devotes itself to the study of useless skills, to enjoyment of exotic drugs, to oppression of those who are weaker than themselves. Right, he's torn out of that context and forced to make his way in a world in which there largely is no such system, right? There are no other there are alternate sources of authority or no sources of authority. So, near the end of While the Gods Laugh, right, when Elric finds the dead god's book, tries to open it up, and it simply crumbles in his hands, right? He says, "I will live my life without ever knowing why I live it, whether it has purpose or not. Perhaps the book could have told me, but would I have believed it even then? I am the eternal skeptic, never sure that my actions are my own, never certain that an ultimate entity is not guiding me." So Elric continues to quest for some external guarantor of meaning in his life, right? This is why he wants the book. But he never gets it. He never finds it. There's never a satisfactory answer for him as to why things are the way they are, why he is the way he is. Now, we also talked about the influence of quantum physics on Moorcock's work, and this is most clear in one of the concepts that ties just about all of Moorcock's science fiction and fantasy output together, the idea of the multiverse. According to Mark Scroggins, Moorcock's multiverse is an infinite series of occasionally interacting but mostly separate parallel universes, which provides local settings and habitations for the various avatars of the Eternal Champion. So, as we said, most of Moorcock's heroes are imagined to be essentially the same person, but operating in different contexts, right? In different time periods, on different worlds that are all sort of in parallel, in universes that are running parallel to each other. There is sort of one novel he writes in the 70s where most of these incarnations actually meet and work together. But that's not the norm. Now, he first mentions the concept of the multiverse in a book called The Sundered Worlds in 1966. And we know that the Elric stories actually date from earlier. So Elric is sort of written into the concept a bit later, as Moorcock writes these multiverse stories in the late 60s and early 70s. He begins to add Elric and Elric's world into this larger multiverse. But he was actually, the character was at first conceived without this idea in mind. Now, the multiverse is riven by conflict not between good and evil, as we see in Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, but between law and chaos. This is Moorcock's symbol for chaos, right? A circle with 9 arrows pointing off in different directions. And this is a symbol for law. A single arrow pointing in a single direction. And Elric himself defines the conflict between law and chaos to his companions Moonglum and Shirilla thusly in While the Gods Laughed. The upholders of chaos state in such a world as they rule, all things are possible. Opponents of chaos, those who ally themselves to the forces of law, say that without law, nothing material is possible. So, in a chaos-driven world, right, anything can happen, but all things are ephemeral. There's no stability. Nothing lasts. In a world ruled solely by law, nothing changes. Order is constant. So you have stability, but you have no progression, no change. So what Moorcock and his protagonists typically aim for is to uphold the balance. So when things get too far one way or the other, that's when an eternal champion shows up. So the eternal champion assumes different identities on different worlds in the multiverse, but is by and large assumed to be the same person, more or less. And wittingly or unwittingly, this individual fights to maintain the balance between law and chaos in the universe, right? If a world gets too stable, the eternal champion shows up to upset it. If a world gets too lawless, for example, in the Dorian Hawkmoon novels Moorcock wrote in the late 60s and early 70s, then the champion fights on the side of law to restore that balance. Now, once again, this is a concept that develops after Elric's debut, and one that Elric doesn't necessarily fit quite cleanly into. Moorcock clearly imagines Elric as one of these eternal champions, or an avatar of the eternal champion, but he is a servant of chaos in a world that is itself sort of chaotic, right? In a world that is itself kind of unstable. You have all these young barbarian kingdoms rising up as the decadent Melnibonian Empire crumbles. So yeah, Elric is regarded as a part of this series, a part of this concept, but again, because he was conceived before Moorcock had really thought all this out, yeah, he sometimes doesn't quite seem to fit the pattern. Now, it's probably worth also talking a little bit about Elric's relationship with his black sword, Stormbringer. So let's look at a couple of passages. The first, from the Dreaming City. He reached it and put his fingers around the hilts. At once it settled in his hand, and Elric felt strength seep slowly back into his aching body. Then he realized that he and the sword were interdependent, for though he needed the blade, Stormbringer, parasitic, required a user. Without a man to wield it, the blade was also powerless. So, Elric's relationship to Stormbringer is, in the one sense, like an addict's relationship to a drug, right? He needs it to feel the rush that keeps him alive. But it's also made clear that the sword needs him in order to work the kind of mayhem it wants to work in the world. Right? Without Elric, without a wielder, Stormbringer is powerless. Now, I think we sort of see more of that kind of like rush of the drug addict, the kind of high that an addict gets from a drug, from this segment in While the Gods Laugh, right? With a mighty effort, he pulled Stormbringer from its scabbard, and he smiled in relief as the evil rune sword moaned faintly and slowly. Its song increased in power as black flame flickered along its length. Already the power was flowing into Elric's body, giving him renewed vitality. But even as strength returned, Elric's crimson eyes flared with terrible misery. His dependence on the sword brings him no joy, right? The power of the sword brings him no happiness, no comfort. One, because he knows himself to be, he knows that he's eternally bound to it. Secondly, because the sword makes him do terrible things. The death of Cimmeril near the, sort of in the middle of the Dreaming City, right? When her maddened brother hurls her onto the end of Elric's blade, right? Stormbringer doesn't care who or what it kills, as long as it gets to kill. Elric does care, but can't release himself from the sword's power, right? In part because if he does, he goes back to being weak, puny, and listless. All right, so those are the major issues that I want you to think about as you read the Elric stories. For next time, we're going to be reading a book that may seem in some ways only tangentially related to the weird, but trust me, it's definitely in dialogue with these other books. It's Ursula K. Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea, and try to think about the following as you read Wizard of Earthsea. First, Le Guin has a lot of interest in anthropology, and one of the things that has always bugged her about the secondary worlds created by most fantasists is that they tend to be extremely similar in geography, in racial makeup, and in social structure to medieval Europe, right? So she sort of regards this as a failure of imagination on the part of fantasy writers. So do you think she has succeeded in making her world of Earthsea genuinely different from the average Anglo-American fantasy world, and why or why not? At a point early in the novel, the hero, Ged, releases a threat to himself and to others while he's studying to be a wizard on the island of Roke. What is the nature of the threat? What is he trying to do when he sets it loose? And so what? Like, how does this fit into the larger narrative pattern? Third, the magic of Earthsea is based largely on names. So I want you to pay attention to how and why names operate in the novel, why they're so important. And finally, how does Ged finally defeat his nemesis? And does this encounter look in any way familiar to you? Okay, so that'll do it for Michael Moorcock and for the Elric Tales. Next time, A Wizard of Earthsea.